Thank you, Andra. Good morning, everyone. I am excited to be here with all of you today to share a few things with you around transforming literacy leadership through structured literacy implementation. Our agenda this morning, I'll go through an introduction of myself and share with you a little bit of my background, as well as going through the research that I have done in Pennsylvania around this topic. Then we'll move into 6 bold moves that you as a literacy leader could do in your buildings, in your districts as soon as tomorrow to really implement this structured literacy change. And finally, I'm going to leave you with some resources that you could use in your practice. Please feel free to throw any questions in the Q&A that you'd like to interrupt me while I'm presenting to ask or bring up at the very end of the presentation. So first, I would love to share with you a little bit about myself. I began my educational journey as a classroom teacher. I began as a kindergarten teacher. I share with friends that it was the hardest job I ever had. I worked as a kindergarten teacher my first year and then moved into first grade my second year. I had the amazing privilege of looping with my first graders to second grade, which was one of my favorite years. I really got to know the families and get involved in really what that curriculum looked like moving from a first grade to a second grade curriculum. I thought second grade was going to be my home until my amazing leaders shared with me that third grade is where I was going to be spending the following year. So yes, I felt like a first year teacher for 4 years in a row. Thankfully, I spent 8 years in third grade where I found my home. I really enjoyed third grade. And after 11 years in the classroom, I felt this feeling of being stagnant. I'm not sure if any of you have experienced that, but I really was kind of feeling a little burnt out. And I just felt like I was not giving my students or my peers the all of me that I had to offer. So at that time, I sought a different position in a neighboring district, teaching 4th grade English language arts and social studies only, where I shared a group of students in the morning and then switched a different group of students in the afternoon. And the following year, I did that in 5th grade. So 15 years of a K-5 experience as an educator. I had an amazing opportunity with the intermediate unit IU-17 in Pennsylvania to become a literacy consultant. And that is really where I tell people that I learned how to do better. The science of reading was not in my background when I went to college. It was also not in my background when I received my master's degree. And so when I became that literacy consultant, I had the privilege of joining sessions at Patton and other places to continue my education and really understand the science of reading and go ahead and coach teachers and leaders around what structured literacy looks like in the classroom. During that time as a consultant, I also became a letters facilitator, where I was able to host sessions at the IU as well as inside districts to talk about building this knowledge for their teachers and leaders. At the IU, we continued to evolve and the need for a curriculum specialist arose. And so I joined that space really to grow myself, not only in that K-5 space, but really to be thinking through our comprehensive planning K-12. So what does it look like to make a comprehensive plan K-12 that includes this important work in the elementary level, but also pushes us into that secondary literacy or adolescent literacy space as well. There's a large need for that. So I continued to grow the leaders that I was supporting there in that space, as well as working on continuous school improvement with the schools at IU-17. 2 years ago, Lexia Learning gave me an amazing opportunity to join them as an outreach specialist, where I worked with regional offices like intermediate units and their different state organizations like PASCD, for example, but I was doing this across 21 states. So from Wisconsin through Maine and down to North Carolina was my territory. I worked with many state leaders around their literacy legislation and what they were doing to improve the laws for their readers and their teachers and their leaders. And then finally, I was with Alexia Learning as a state solutions manager, where I really met with leaders across the country talking about this legislation. Just in April of this year, I was able to join the 95% group as the Vice President of Educational Strategy. I'm super excited to be there and share with you today some of their work and their bold moves for this literacy legislation, or excuse me, for this literacy leadership space. So let's move into my research next. And let me share with you what I was able to find that really sparked my passion for this literacy leadership role. In 2 years ago, actually just 2 years ago, earlier this week, I defended my dissertation through Immaculata University. And there I shared my research around elementary principals and their self-efficacy and foundational literacy leadership. So my survey consisted of 62 Pennsylvania public school elementary principals. You can see there that I tried to make sure that I had representation across the entire state of Pennsylvania, making sure that I was really getting the perceptions of our leaders from multiple regions of our state. You can see some of the demographics there that I think are important to highlight. Most participants, actually almost 80% of them, had been a principal for more than 4 years. So most of my survey participants have been doing the job for a little while. Almost half of them, 42%, did have experience teaching kindergarten through second grade prior to becoming a leader, which I think is really important to highlight. However, I did also during my interviews find out that although almost half of them had experience teaching kindergarten through second grade, very, very few of them had knowledge of the science of reading or coursework in the science of reading during that time. And then of my participants, there were 19% of them that held that reading specialist certification. So what's important and why I want to share that with you is because some of my findings connected to prior researchers across the country. So this first bullet talks about how my study identified a few challenges that these leaders were facing as they tried to be effective literacy leaders in their space. One of the major challenges that came up over and over in my research was really these principals who participated, they found that they had a lack of knowledge in these foundational literacy skills. And that challenge was consistent with some others across the country that were doing research. For example, the Lead for Literacy Center, they found the same, as well as Yanni in 2015. They were also finding that they were struggling with getting in the classroom, being able to have time to go in and do observations. But more importantly, when they did go in to do those observations, they were struggling with knowing where to turn to give guidance for their educators. The second area there talks about Thomas and Hanford, and that they were really talking about all areas, excuse me, of literacy knowledge are perceived to be essential for principals' knowledge base. So it's not just a phonics gap. It's not just a phonemic awareness gap. It really is all areas of literacy knowledge that these principals felt they needed to have support and knowledge in to be effective in their literacy instructional programming. As well as those concerns that my participants felt, they also acknowledged that they really needed more opportunities for professional learning or professional development. And few of my participants shared that they have the ability for genuine learning. So this really highlighted the need for me to go out and find ways that were supporting leaders across the country in growing their knowledge in the science of reading, and even more importantly, growing their knowledge in how to be those literacy leaders, going in and doing effective walkthroughs, making sure that they understand how to do data-driven conversations or meetings with their teams. The final bullet on this slide shares that a researcher named Fullen talked about the need for a principal to model lifelong learning. There really is so much importance in our literacy leaders or our leaders in a building to really model what it looks like to be that learner and continue to grow in this space of building their knowledge. As we know, Pennsylvania does require continuous learning and credits with Act 48 and Act 45. However, Pennsylvania does not require administrators to do specific professional development in one space or the other, except for our bills that are coming soon to be passed. There might be a slight change in that. I believe that there's further research needed on this topic, and that it's really crucial that we continue this work to inform our local and state administrators, and specifically our policymakers in the area of literacy leadership, Two quotes that really stood out with me while I was doing my research that I continue to share across the country is one there from 2007, excuse me, that talks about that principles, affect student achievement indirectly by influencing the influencers. We as leaders are not boots on the ground in the classroom every single day. However, our actions and our words really, really influence those that are. So how can we be mindful that we're modeling actions, and how can we be mindful with our words and our resources that we're sharing with our teams to make sure that we truly are influencing those influencers? And the other quote came from 2019 from International Literacy Association. And this is really talking about how principals are the lead learners and the chief architects of culture and instructional programs at their schools. And really how principals need to be walking the talk. Again, finding a way that you're building your knowledge and being effective in the way that you're modeling this for your educators in your buildings and in your district. So all that being said, how do we do it, right? How do I take this back to my building or my district and really, really invest in some change? So I believe in the power of leadership. I believe that we as leaders across the country right now have an amazing opportunity to shift our mindset from surviving change to growing through change. The onset of the pandemic really, really put most of our leaders across the country into this survival mode of making sure we were doing everything we needed to keep our students and our teachers safe and healthy. And now that we're hopefully coming out of that major survival mode, we can really think through, okay, what are our students telling us that they need help in? Where do our educators need help? How can we really truly grow through this change that we're faced with right now? So I believe to be able to do that, we need to make bold decisions. So bold change as a leader takes bold leadership. So I'm here to share with you 6 bold moves that Laura Stewart from 95% Group created that shares with leaders across the country what they can do to really do this bold change in their districts or in their buildings. The first bold move is making sure that you as a leader understand the principles of evidence aligned instruction. Making sure that we as leaders know what does our knowledge bank need to include. Because what your teachers need to know to be boots on the ground instructional leaders is very different than what you as a principal require to be that effective literacy leader. I can share with you the Reading League's definition of the science of reading there on the slide. They determine the science of reading to be a vast, interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. So I bolded those words, vast, interdisciplinary body of research, because I need leaders across the country to understand this body of research continues to grow on a daily basis. And there is so much to learn and so much to read about. But I believe that there are ways that leaders can invest in a science of reading program that allows them to get the knowledge they need, as well as how to implement that change. At the end of this presentation, there are a list of resources, and all of the links that I have in here you can get to. For example, the first link on this slide talks about 95% Groups 2.0, and that is really where you can find these bold moves, as well as some other great information around this topic. And finally, I have a question for all of you to be thinking about right now. It's at the bottom of the slide here, and it says, what depth of knowledge do leaders need in the science of reading and the science of learning to be bold leaders? So I really would need you to be thinking about that, because your depth of knowledge that you need as a leader is different than what your teachers are going to need in your buildings. I also want to make sure that we all agree that this is our mindset where we need to be, because 95% of our students can learn to read when we're using instruction and programs based in the science of reading. So if you've looked at Pennsylvania's NAEP scores recently, you will find that a little more than 30% of Pennsylvania's students are proficient in reading. That's the positive way to look at that stat. However, I like to acknowledge the other piece of that statistic, which shows almost 70% of Pennsylvania students, according to that research, are not proficient in reading. That's a scary statistic, in my opinion, and one that should be setting off alarms to all of us across the state. And this data helps share with us that according to this data, 30% of our students that walk into our classrooms are going to learn how to read regardless of what we do. So if you think about those two statistics, 30% can learn to read regardless of what we do, and Pennsylvania's right around that 30%. I think if nothing else, this shares that we have to make some major changes. And when we do make some major changes in literacy instruction and literacy leadership, we could really get much closer to that 95% statistic. So going back to our bold moves, bold move number 2 is confronting gaps in data. I remember when I was at the intermediate unit, data. We talked about data all the time. However, talking about data alone is not going to solve our issue. We really need to think about what are we doing with that data? How are we informing our teachers to use that data to change their instruction in the classroom? How are we informing parents to look at the data that we're sharing with them of their students to really change what they're doing at home, to build that partnerships with the school? So as a leader, my suggestion for your bold move is to confront gaps in data and to think about, are 95% or more of your third graders reading at or above benchmark? And if they're not, how can you and your leadership team be bold with looking at that data and confronting gaps? There is a statistic here from Torgerson that talks about after evidence-aligned instruction is put in place, the percentage of first graders below the 30th percentile can be reduced to 4 to 6%. And this really is where we get that statistic of 95% of our students can learn to read with evidence-based instruction. Bold move number 3, building a coherent and focused district-wide literacy plan. And this literacy plan must include adequate time for that literacy instruction in their daily routine. So I want you to think about this because we all have comprehensive plans that our district puts in place that we submit to the Department of Education on a 3-year cycle in Pennsylvania. And in that comprehensive plan, we include our literacy plan, right? So what are we doing as a leader? I want you to think about this yourself and do some self-reflection here. I want you to be thinking about, are you as a leader letting this happen? Are you letting this literacy plan happen? Meaning, we have this program, it's mandated by our district or our building, we've adopted, and educators are expected to make some changes, right? Am I as a leader just sitting back and letting this happen? Or am I as a leader helping it happen? Helping it happen really is thinking around the adoption has been made. Now I'm supporting teachers in maybe going by them, supporting them with resources. But the educators are really sitting around left to figure this out or solve the problems or challenges that they're being faced with. So am I helping it happen? And the third question I'm asking you is, are you making it happen? And the difference with making it happen is that you have an implementation team that is held accountable for not only developing these plans, but also supporting these plans in implementation. When issues arise with implementing new curriculum or taking the knowledge that you're learning in professional development and translating it into that structured literacy implementation, are we as a team really thinking through those plans and coming up with some solutions? So are you, as a leader, letting it happen, helping it happen, or making it happen? As I mentioned, in Pennsylvania, we have the comprehensive planning, which really asks our literacy team to create a plan of action. And if you have not visited this website, I have linked it here for you in Pennsylvania. They give you a tool that's called the State Literacy Needs Assessment. It's an amazing tool that you as a team can sit down and go through. And the way I suggest doing that is that your team comes together Each member goes through that tool from Pennsylvania and independently rate your system based on the rubric that's provided for you. And then come back and gather as a team to really discuss the findings that you all independently rated and see where you have some similarities or even some disagreements. And then finally, from that needs assessment, really identify your priorities for growth and intervention and go back and revisit your local plan and see if it's in alignment with the needs that you came up with from that tool. Moving through bold move number 4. Bold move number 4 is really suggesting that we adopt an ecosystem of proven curriculum resources that efficiently translate research to practice. This word ecosystem is one that I want you to be thinking about and really reflecting on when you leave this session today. Our ecosystem, meaning all of the tools that we're providing in our educators' toolbox that they can reach into and pull out during those reading block, during that specific time that we have set aside with them, so that when they're looking at and they're confronting those gaps in data, they know what tools to pull from their toolbox to go through and provide their students with the instruction that's needed all throughout their tiers, whether it's whole group instruction in tier 1, or they're working with students specifically in a gap that they found through their tier 2, or even intensive instruction through tier 3. As a leader, we should really be thinking about how our ecosystem is supporting that need. I've included at the bottom of this slide some hallmarks of this effective systematic approach, and they really should include things like consistent academic language. That word consistent is so very important. Making sure that we're using focused instruction that is guided by those assessments that we were just discussing. Do we have consistent routines across all of our tiers of instruction so that our students are understanding how to replicate that when they go then and do it independently? And finally, providing significant evidence through third-party research studies. We're choosing things to go into that toolbox that are proven, effective resources. Making sure that real students have tried these curricular resources and making sure that they have studies to show that they're going to be effective. So when our teachers pull into their toolbox, they're pulling out resources that have proven results. Bold move number 5 is next. Bold move number 5 is really about how can we as leaders support our teachers when they're building their knowledge and changing their practice. So really bold move number 5 is talking about how do we shift from knowledge to skill to practice. And I truly believe that the key to doing this is coaching. When coaching is layered on as a support for implementation, knowledge and theory can be transferred into practice. I know Patton has amazing supports that they can offer you around this coaching specifically. Pennsylvania also has amazing intermediate units where we have literacy advisors and literacy coaches that can help with this coaching. 95% group as well has great coaching availability. So really thinking through as a leader, how am I making this bold move number 5 of ensuring that not only are my leaders and my teachers in my system building that knowledge base, but more importantly, how are they putting that into practice? So I found a website that I have linked here for you that I think is a great tool that you can use moving forward after this presentation today, that talks about how can we as leaders empower, collaborate, and connect. Because it's really, really essential that we think about these walls of our classrooms, these interactions in our classroom, they tell a story. So how can we as leaders leverage what we're seeing in these classrooms and bring it back to our mission statement, our vision for our district and our building, and think about what our priorities need to be. So how can we make sure that we are, as leaders, taking our leadership practices and making sure that they are deeply rooted in the realities of daily teaching and learning? So I've hyperlinked a few things here for you. There was an Education Week article titled recently, Principals, You Aren't the Only Leader in Your School. How can we make these leadership teams where we have many stakeholders that have a voice, that can truly understand our organizational view and can truly grow into this space. It's that article talks about as leaders who never spend time in the classroom with teachers can never truly know what's best for students. So I know it's so hard. It's so hard to find time to get into those classrooms. But Bold New Move number 5 really talks about how crucial it is for us to make sure that we are walking those halls. And there's another link there from Lauren Kaufman that's talking about an article, When Leaders Walk the Halls. She has some great suggestions for you on what you can do. Finally, the last bold move number 6. In my opinion, one of the most important ones is how are we planning for sustainability? Science of reading, structured literacy, these are not the next shiny initiative that's going to become a dusty binder on your shelf in the next 2 or 3 years. This is change that we must embrace across the country to really make change with our proficiency for our students in reading and writing. So how are we as a leader making this bold move number 6 to plan for sustainability? I oftentimes talk about literacy, the long game, right? It's a long game. This plan needs to be thinking through not only the school year that you're in, or I should say the school year you're getting ready to start, the 24-25 school year. Yes, that needs to have a plan. However, more importantly, we need to think about this long game. Are we having a 4-year vision of how we can create sustainability for this initiative, making sure our teachers and leaders are getting that knowledge base and that understanding of implementation throughout that time? So here are 4 steps you could do. You could start by forming a guided coalition, again, going back and making that team that we were speaking of earlier, making sure that your communication is over and over and over in many different ways, which I'm going to share with you finally. How can we strive for progress, not perfection? NAEP scores are one great way for us to take a look at our proficiency. However, there are multiple tools that districts use that can show growth. I remember a few years ago when I was supporting a district and we were looking through their Acadience data, and we really went to those growth progress charts to talk about the color of their stars, right? How did their students show growth throughout that school year? Because growth is change, and we need to make sure that as we take these bold steps, we learn how to pivot, we learn how to keep going, and we learn how to take that next step to make sure that this is continuously improving this process. So the final thing on bold move number 6 talks about, as a leader, self-assess the steps that you're taking to create the sustainability model, and make sure that we're really striving for the end game to be that 95% of students as readers are reading at proficiency. So I know Andrew dropped in the chat some of these resources for you to use, but I want to leave you with the idea of that consistent, relentless communication with your teachers and your other leaders in your network. I encourage you to share out, whether it's through a professional network that you join or with your teachers, multiple ways that they can continue to build this knowledge. So I've left you with a few things here. For example, there's an Ed Week article that recently came out that talks about leading the science of reading. Principals share what they've learned. Let's talk about what we've learned, right? Let's share what we're doing across the country that's working. Emily Hanford has an amazing podcast series called Soul to Story. If you have not tuned in, I highly recommend you to do so. Please do not start at the end. Go all the way back to the beginning. It's an amazing podcast series that you can drop to your teachers and your leaders in your networks. The third resource listed here is from a Lead for Literacy guide. It really talks about how we can improve this implementation for these evidence-based practices. Dr. Nell is an amazing researcher, and I have linked there a document where she talks about the courage to lead and how we as literacy leaders can really think through why this matters and how can we make the most of it when we're trying to transform this educational leadership. There's a video blog that I linked there for you around transformational leadership. And then finally, Laura Stewart from 95% Group was joined by Mitchell Brookins, and they really have an amazing series that talks about courageous leaders that I encourage you to take a look at. So again, providing multiple resources in multiple formats, because some of us only have 10 minutes when we're going to soccer practice to listen to something, and others want to read an article when we're getting ready for bed, right? How can we focus on walkthroughs and common look fors? And finally, making sure that we're celebrating successes. Even the smallest successes can really empower teachers to continue with that work. I want to leave you with a QR code that where you can connect with me on my LinkedIn page. I've also included my email there, and I encourage you to never hesitate to reach out. If you have questions in your leadership journey that you think I can help you with, please don't hesitate to connect with me. And Andrew, I'll turn it over to you and see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Erin, for all that information and sharing all the resources that you curated. I'll just pause. I will just check. I don't see any questions right now in the Q&A or in the chat, but if people are thinking now, please feel free to put anything, questions or comments in those two areas. You're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat for the information. Giving a little more think time. Erin, as people are thinking a little bit and thinking about their own sites, you talked a little bit about establishing a sustainability plan. What would that include? Can you share a little bit more about what that might look like?
Sure, absolutely. So I think it's easier for us to plan for the year that's right in front of us, right? And make sure that we have the right resources and the right knowledge, professional learning ready for that. However, I encourage you to look further ahead and think through how you can continue that to go knowledge base to grow. So thinking through not only maybe joining a tool like Top 10 Tools to get your teachers involved in some sort of knowledge base, but also what does that look like once that learning is over? Because the science of reading, like I mentioned earlier, continues to grow. That body of research is evolving every single day. So how can I make sure that my sustainability plan includes the most recent research to make sure that we're up to date and that our curriculum is not just turning the page because it's Thursday, right? We're really thinking through what does our data look like and what should our instruction do to confront those data gaps. So that sustainability plan really, in my opinion, has to include not only professional development, but also ways that we're joining together as teams, literacy teams and other teams to continue that work.
You spoke a little bit about coaching, and I know many districts don't have the ability to have coaches as part of their team members. Have you found that schools have thought a little bit, outside of the box? How can they include coaching if in their buildings if they don't have personnel that are specific to that role?
Wonderful question as well. I find that a lot of our teachers are so involved in this science of reading journey. Many of them have grabbed a hold of it and taught themselves. They're reading the research independently. They're listening to the podcast that I shared. And so you will find leaders among your staff that are well versed in this. And so allowing them to maybe have a half an hour of your faculty meeting to share things that they're learning, right? Coaching, yes, the crystal ball, what would be the most amazing thing is to have a designated staff member that can go in and observe and give feedback. But like you mentioned, that's not something that most of us have, at the ready. So instead, how can we rely on our intermediate units and the literacy coaches? How can we rely on our staff at Patton to help come in and support that? How can we take advantage of grants that the Department of Ed might be offering that we can involve ourselves in some of these initiatives so that we get the support that's outside of just our district personnel? Pennsylvania has an amazing support system through the intermediate units and through Patent that many states do not have the novelty of having. So if you're not taking advantage of that, I highly recommend you reach out to your intermediate unit or your patent representative to see how can they help you in that support. I know at 95% Group, we also offer coaching, and it's a really amazing way to make sure that the resources your teachers are pulling out of their toolbox, they know how to use, and they're using them effectively.
So just another couple of questions more around barriers too. I think so there were a couple different ideas. One was like what at the board level, the barriers that some of the districts are experiencing at the board member level and making these shifts and those kinds of things. But then also some of the faculty barriers, like the resistance to change and how, you know, this can be a really big shift for some of the school districts. Do you have any recommendations about navigating around some of those, you know, top to bottom kind of things that that the systems would need to do to be able to shift?
Great question and reality, right, Lisa? So I think there are some amazing school districts across the state of Pennsylvania that have done this really, really, really well. And they are sharing their story, and I'm so thankful for it because they would be a great way for other leaders to go and get those specific to Pennsylvania, right? But going to the board question, I think really sharing very high level need as a system, as an educational system, our plates are so full of priorities, right? Everyone's priority is the most important. However, I think we as leaders, to be literacy leaders, need to share with our board members and even our communities why literacy needs to be at the top of that priority list. Share research with them, share success stories with them, that when we put literacy at the top of that priority list, what change did we see? And not only data specific, proficiency levels, but even anecdotal conversations with students or ways that it's changed students' lives. I'll share very quickly an experience that I had in a district in Pennsylvania a few years ago, where I came in to model a small group lesson. And I had a bunch of really eager kindergarten students run in, excited to meet a new friend, and got up on their knees. And the one little girl shared with me, "Mrs. Hamilton, I don't know how to read." And I was like, "Oh, I think you do. We're going to do this. It's going to be great." And she was adamant. She straight turned around to find her teacher behind her that was watching me. And she said, "Tell her I don't know how to read. Like, tell her that's true." So we were actually running through a decodable text that her teacher had shared with me what specific sound spelling patterns they had mastered or learned and secured. And so I very strategically chose a text that I knew would be appropriate for them to go through this exercise. And by the end of reading that text, she was so confident in being able to read independently that text accurately that she walked back to her classroom proud as a peacock with her shoulders high. A year later, I walked into that district to continue to support them. And when I walked by her classroom, she ran to the hallway, found me, drugged me back in by the hand, and had me watch her read a book. And her entire perception of being a reader changed because we gave her the tools that she needed to be proficient. And so I think that those stories are so important to bring to board members. It's not always about, how many percent of our students are proficient or not proficient. Sometimes our board members need to get those heartstring messages that really share what we're doing for our community with these students that are truly learning to read.
Thanks, Erin. There's a question about, you mentioned the importance of common look-fors. Do you have any resources as an example to highlight, common look-fors?
Great question. So in the document that I shared, that is the assessment that Pennsylvania offers. I can probably go back to that really quick. Maybe not. Okay. Let's see. Sorry. So I apologize to go through this really quick, but let me find it really quick. So this literacy needs assessment that Pennsylvania offers. In that document, you will find a list of things that you as a system have areas for growth. And in that, we'll provide you with specific areas that you can go through and focus on with your staff. So one suggestion I have is once you identify those priorities as a team, come up with specific months that you're going to focus on things. Let me give you an example. In the month of October, we're going to focus on vocabulary instruction in Tier 1. And these are the things that as a literacy leader, when I come into your classroom, I'm going to be looking for. These are the routines that our ecosystem shares are the correct routines that we should be doing consistently through the tiers. At a faculty meeting, you could share those common look-fors. So there's no gotcha moment, right? Our educators aren't feeling like I'm coming in for an observation and I'm looking to give them negativity. Instead, this is our common language for vocabulary instruction that we're all doing across our tiers. Create that common language as a team and then share it with your educators. Find the tools in the curriculum that you're using, pull it out. This is the consistent academic language, so there's no gotcha moment. There are tools out there from different companies that will give you specific language for those pieces that you're doing look-fors. I would suggest you go through your whatever curriculum you're using and find if you can have that coach again from that curriculum to give you those specific look-fors. But I love when leaders find each month that they have a target specific task that they're working on, be it vocabulary, be it phonemic awareness, be it phonics, whatever it might be. Have a specific focus for those look-fors so that I'm providing resources to my teachers in that area. I'm providing guidance when I, as a leader, go into observation. If I see specific gaps in what I'm expecting, I can go back to my resources or go back to my IU or go back to Pat and say, I'm finding my staff is all having a struggle in this space. When they're delivering vocabulary instruction, they're all struggling with this. Is there a tool I can go back and give them for guidance on that specific? So really rely on those that are around you to help you with that, those resources.
Thank you.
Sure.
I know also you mentioned a consistent language, and our kids who struggle the most often are going to the most different places to receive instruction and support. So can you talk a little bit about how core teachers in the classroom, reading specialists, SLPs, how, process to go through about aligning that?
Yeah, I think that's really, really important for all students, specifically those that are really transferring between teachers. They have many teachers that are giving them instruction. So again, it comes back to this ecosystem, in my opinion, that we're making sure that whatever tools are in our toolbox for all the tiers have that consistent academic language. And I'll also include in there those routines, right? To make sure that we're using the same routines in Tier 1 whole group that we're using when our students are going to a different a teacher or a different educator. I find the most simple one to explain to people is really the use of how we're mimicking phonemes. So when we use, our fingers or our hands to show how many phonemes we're counting, some teachers use their fingers to put up, some turn this way, some turn this way. That's really a difference. And we as proficient readers don't understand that that's a big difference. But to a student that's trying to really understand this alphabetic code, that is a big difference for them. So not only is our academic language need to be consistent, but really the ways that we're giving that resource or giving that instruction need to be consistent as well.
So Erin, I think you had referenced the science of learning. So as through the science of learning and melding that with the science of reading and pulling those two together for administrators and leaderships. And then again, you had referenced it in that Bold Move 5, like helping support. Could you explain a little bit more about how the science of learning can be applied to moving a system?
Yes, I love that. So the implementation piece is really the hardest part, in my opinion. There has been so much legislation moving across the country in literacy that's really exciting to watch. However, that's the easy part. That's step one, right? So as a country, we're acknowledging that we really need to make a change. But how do we take the knowledge that our teachers are receiving in the science of reading, and how do we transform that into what does that look like, sound like, feel like in the classroom? And again, I go back to that coaching piece, right? modeling for teachers what it looks like, sounds like, feels like in practice. So finding resources that you can share with them that, okay, this is the knowledge that you learned. This is why we need to be specifically doing academic instruction, or excuse me, vocabulary instruction like this. This is what Anita Archer is telling us. That's the best way to do it. But what does that look like, sound like, feel like in practice? Watch Anita deliver that instruction. Watch other educators across the country that are doing it really, really well, because we have to make sure that we're layering on this support for implementation. If you have a teacher in your building that is doing a phenomenal job, ask them to open up their doors. Ask them to open up their doors to allow their colleagues to come in and observe what they're doing. If you have educators that are in a different building and you have ability to share like a differentiated coach or a differentiated supervision model with them, and they could maybe move into a peer coaching experience, that can be so powerful to do peer coaching with another educator in your district or in your building, that you can go in and observe what they're doing and watch specific things for them. They can come in and observe what you're doing and watch specific things for you. That's a way to use your own staff to help with that coaching. Because we really need to have these like layers of support. So as a leader, as much as I want to be in those classrooms observing all the time, reality is I have managerial duties that take me out of that space on a consistent basis. So how can I use my staff to help do some of that as well, by doing that peer coaching or opening up those doors for those model classrooms that we can go in and watch? Breaking down the barriers too, I think sometimes educators are hesitant to share what they're doing because they feel like they're being perceived as, a brown noser or a know-it-all, but we need to get over that. We need to get over it, and we need to be opening our doors and saying, this is working for my kids. Come in and see it. And you know what? Those same things you might try next year, and you might have to shift a little bit because they might not work for your kids that come across your door next year. But if they're working for your kids and your data is showing it, open up your doors and share it with your staff.
Looking at data too is such a big piece. And you had the research looking at, the percentages of kids who are going to read regardless of how we instruct, and those who need that systematic explicit instruction. But data is such a hot button issue. It feels personal. Can you talk a little bit about ways to build a trust or a community around data, not necessarily the data analysis, but just ways that leaders can build that community of looking at data and looking at it as something to grow and improve?
One of the hardest things that I think leaders have to do is to build that culture of trust and be able to confront these gaps in data so that we're being perceived as how to change, not using data to show what you're not doing as an educator, right? It's not about what I'm doing wrong. It's about, what do my students need? The data that we should be looking at should really be looked at as a mindset of, what does this data show me my students need? And so how can we go through and pull up our data and say, as a first grade team, we're all seeing that there is a gap here. Maybe that alerts us to the curricular resources that we're pulling out of our toolbox is missing that. So how can we go find something to fill that gap? That's a really big shift. And I know several years ago when I was working through with the school district that was part of a grant, talking through, they were using Acadians at the time. And a lot of them were struggling because their words, not mine, their words, they had a lot of red kids, they kept saying. Our kids are still red. And so trying to change that mindset, I encouraged them to find the report that was their growth report. And in a growth report, through Acadians, it shares all of the students, and there are color-coded stars at the end of that growth report. And it will show you how much growth those students are making. And it was really, really eye-opening for the teachers I was working with to show them that, yes, your student might be still showing that they are in intensive need. they have an intensive need. However, look at their growth. And if they're not showing growth, what are we doing for them in that tier 2, tier 3 instruction? Have we really done a progress monitoring and checked that what we're doing is working? Or are we still on the same plan and it's not working for them? So I encourage districts to have consistent data driven conversations where they're looking at growth and then checking on, is their tier 2 or tier 3 healthy? Meaning, is it working? If it's not working, are we revisiting what we're using as those tools? Making sure that our students that are on grade level are also still showing growth, because that was a huge eye opener for the teachers I was looking at. Sometimes we get so focused on our students that are struggling that our students that are on grade level are not making the 1 year's growth either. So it's really, really crucial that we're not only looking at our students that are struggling readers, but we're looking at all of the students that are in our classrooms and finding out how can we differentiate our instruction to make sure that all of our students are showing growth. And the report that I was mentioning from Cadence is just one tool you can use for that.
Erin, thank you so much for this slide that you have projected here is just so it's profound, right? And so when you talk about confronting gaps in the data, 95% is huge.
It is.
Where some schools may see, let's just say 40% of their third graders reading on grade level. I know you mentioned one resource, but I'm really interested in case studies or specific ways that schools have actually confronted the data so that it's practical for school leaders and also for teachers. So can you talk a little bit about that, whether it's, like I said, case studies, protocols, what did schools do so that when we place this question of are 95% of our third graders reading at or above grade level and the teachers see 40%, it's like, whoo, how can we really do that within a year? Yes, it's a goal, right? But we want it to be realistic as well. And then we also don't want them to be overwhelmed with getting there.
Thank you so much for voicing that and sharing that question with me. I believe that, again, going back to literacy, the long game. It is a long game. And if we are not close to 95%, reality of getting to 95% in 1 year, I've not seen it. I've not seen it. It might have happened somewhere, but I have not seen it. Instead, what I would encourage you to do is have that as your goal. But instead of a 1 year timeline, give yourself at least a 3 to 5 year timeline, because there are studies out there, and I'm happy to take your information and share with you afterwards. There are studies out there that show true transformative change take 3 to 5 years to show proficiency levels. So reality is what we put in place just this next school year will take a little while to show up in our proficiency. However, we can monitor that growth. So to address your question, I suggest creating a plan, a long game, if you will, that include professional learning, a plan. What am I going to give my educators as a way to build their knowledge, but also includes curricular resources and coaching support, whether it be through your IU, your patent, your own staff. In that sustainability plan, I encourage you to have specific data points on there where you're monitoring growth, not monitoring proficiency, because you mentioned the frustration that comes with that, right? Instead, monitoring growth. So in that sustainability plan, in the next 1 year, what parts of the school year, and I suggest at least 3, but I highly recommend more than that, when we as teams, grade level teams, can sit down and say, this is our beginning of the year benchmark data. What gaps are we recognizing that we see? What proficiency levels are we in? What resources do we have in our toolbox that we can be pulling out? And then as a leader, think through those faculty meetings that you have or any touch points that you have with your staff and go back through those findings that you had or those priorities that you've identified and making sure that you're touching those and we're delivering those consistent communications with resources, whether it be a blog that you can share or a podcast that you can share, or an article that you can share. And some of your educators might not take advantage of it, but a lot of them will. A lot of them will. They'll open it up, they'll read a little bit of it, and then they will start talking to each other about it. And so our students deserve this, right? Our students deserve that we get to that 95% of them being able to read, because we know that the studies have shown that it's possible. What's not possible, though, is trying to move from 30% to 90% in 1 year. Realistically, you're going to cause frustration if that's what the gold standard is, that we're expecting that to happen. Instead, I truly believe that you have to think through this implementation science. That's that 3 to 5 year journey. Andrea, if you don't mind, if we can capture her contact information, I'd love to send her things after this to be able to follow up with some of the case studies that she asked for.
Sure, Sherry, just put your email to a message to me in the chat and I'll forward it to Erin.
All right,
Thank
we
you.
have yeah, and I don't know if you saw it, Erin, we have another question in the Q&A. So when it comes to the bold move shared, where do you start? Is there a specific order you recommend to start? And I think you started to say just start sharing slowly and getting some capacity within your teachers, within your system. But is there one move that you see really kind of rises to the top?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think back to how we differentiate our instruction for students, I'm going to offer to you that you think about self-reflection and where do you think the best bold move is for you to start, whoever asked that question, because we're all kind of in a different place in our journey, right? We all have different knowledge that we've already acquired or haven't. So really, for me personally, the bold move I'd start with is going to probably be very different than the bold move that someone else starts with. So I think it's going to depend on where you are in your journey as a leader for which bold move that you start with. In my opinion, if you've not started this science of reading journey as a literacy leader and you feel like your knowledge is similar to what the findings of my study were, that you really have a lack of knowledge in this scientifically based research, I believe starting with bold move number 1 is essential, because we cannot walk the talk as a leader if we don't have some capacity and knowledge built around this topic. So the amount of knowledge that a leader needs, I had shared, is very different, in my opinion, than what an educator needs in the classroom. And this is such a vast interdisciplinary body of research. So going through your network of other leaders and asking them to share resources, or going through the resources I shared at the end of this, that EdWeek article is a great place to start, where some principals are sharing their journey and where they started. And maybe there's one of those that you can connect with and is similar to where you are. So if you're not really, if your understanding of the science of reading or structured literacy is the very beginning stages, I would recommend starting with bold move number 1. If you feel like you've already started that and you feel like I have some knowledge in the science of reading, I feel like I'm already doing some of this work, then you can move through some of the other bold moves to begin with instead. I do think bold move number 1, though, is never ending. As a literacy leader, we can't be like, oh, we're done. I know what I need to know. And now I'm going to move on to bold move number 2. That unfortunately isn't, in my opinion, the best way to attack this. Like I mentioned, this research is always culminating, and there are amazing researchers out there that are adding to this body of research every single day. And I know that can be really overwhelming to a lot of leaders. So joining a network of some sort, there are amazing networks out there of principals. There's an elementary principal association in Pennsylvania that you can join if you're not already part of that. PASCD is another really amazing state organization in Pennsylvania. Dr. Lori Stoller is their executive director, and they provide amazing things for leaders to share in this capacity. So joining a network is one that I would also really recommend to get started.
Thank you. And I did grab some emails, so I will send those
Perfect.
to you.
Thank you so much.
Afterwards as well. I had another question in here. Just let me find it. Peer coaching is new to this person, but she's interested. And can it happen between different grade levels, or would it just be across the same grade level?
Great question. So one of my favorite things I ever did as an educator in that K-5 space is, for my supervision, my district offered us an option of peer coaching. And what that entailed was I, as an educator, suggested a few things that in my instruction, I wanted a peer to come in and look for. I gave we had a conference, her and I, specifically around what I wanted her to look for. And then she came into my classroom, observed my instruction, and gave me feedback on the specific things I was looking for as a teacher. I then did the same for her. My experience was when I was a third grade teacher, the other educator that I did peer coaching with, she also was third grade. I do not think it has to be the same grade level, but some advantages that I had doing it with another third grade teacher is that her and I were teaching the same curriculum, but it was really, really insightful for me to go watch the way she delivered that instruction. And to make sure that we're delivering consistent academic language, peer coaching is such an amazing thing to do because I could go in and watch her and make sure that I was using the same academic language that she was. When we met as a grade level team, we could talk about what we saw in each other's instruction that was helpful to change what we were doing. Although her students had a little bit of a different need, of course, my students were different than hers, we still had some commonalities in our data that we could share. Okay, what resources are we pulling from our toolbox? It really just developed a trust between the two of us to be able to share the resources back and forth and really support each other in this coaching aspect. I do think it could be effective across grade levels for many reasons that I mentioned when I went through my educational journey, K through 5. One of my favorite things about going through that, which I hated my principal at the time because I thought, how dare he make me do a new teacher the next year over and over again. But some amazing things that I learned was scope and sequence of our students. And what are they expected to learn as a first grader? What are they expected to learn as a second grader? What are they expected to learn as a third grader? So doing peer coaching across grade levels is wonderful, but also I do believe there could be some powerful benefits doing it from a second grade teacher to a third grade teacher, or with a first grade teacher to a second grade teacher, where they can not only observe each other's instruction and talk about their tools that they're pulling out. If you're building that ecosystem, right, they have a lot of the same tools. So how are we making sure that my students that are leaving second grade, going to third grade are getting what they need? So my experience with peer coaching was within the same grade level. However, I think there could be some great benefits from going between grade levels as well.
Awesome, thank you. I think this one came as a follow-up to the, how do I talk to my teachers about some of the data, especially in some of those systems that we kind of want to write the triangle, as Lena used to say. But leading data meetings, how important is it? Leaders are very busy, I think is where this one is coming from. And, what is leadership participation really supposed to look like in a data meeting?
So just like when we teach our students in a small group reading, we have a lesson plan that we create that's for before, during, and after. I think that same mindset is really important when we're thinking about our data meetings as a leader. What are we asking our teachers to do before they enter that meeting? What are we doing with them during? And what are the asks after they walk away? Because I've seen so many times districts get in this routine of, okay, we have 3 data meetings a year. We're looking at our benchmark data. We're doing the same old, and guess what happens? Nothing changes because we're not doing that before, during, and after mindset. So I encourage you to keep those data meetings on your schedule 100%. However, maybe think about what you're doing in those data meetings or what you're asking for your teachers before and after that will truly change practice based on the gaps that we're seeing. So for example, if I am getting ready to look at my middle of the year data with my first grade team, let's talk about that, right? Before they enter that data meeting, I'm going to ask them to print the report from whatever tool I'm using and bring it with them. But before they bring it with them, I'm going to give them a resource of how to analyze that data. Most companies that you're working with that you're using for your screeners or for your data will give you guidance on look fors or how to analyze that data. If you do not have that, I highly recommend you going to your intermediate unit or your patent representative and asking for help in that space. Because if they, as teachers, do not know how to analyze the data you're looking at, it's worthless, completely worthless. And then we're taking the time out of our instruction to assess our students, and we're not doing anything with the results. So step one, in my opinion, is creating a before. Asking your teachers, what are you needing them to do before they enter that meeting? And it's not a super cumbersome, heavy lift. It's just as simple as printing off the report that they need to be looking at and giving them maybe 2 things to analyze prior to joining the meeting. During your data team meeting, then, really as a leader, as a literacy leader or a principal in the building, you should just be a facilitator. It's really hard to not stand there and dictate what the conversation is, but instead, I really encourage you to have specific questions that maybe you have posted around the room that you're going to bring up to all of your grade level teams that are consistent, so that you're just posing the question and letting them talk to each other, right? I've also been in a lot of data team meetings where it turns into, well, we can't, or it's this problem, or it's that problem, or it's because of this, or it's because of that. I encourage you to try to change that culture, which is really hard. I recognize it's really hard, but try to change that culture by showing the growth. Point out the positives, point out what's working really well. And if one teacher's data is different than the rest, ask the questions about what they're doing. What are you doing with your students that's helping you get the growth that we're seeing in this category? And then finally, having that plan of action for after. So we have the before, we have the during the meeting. Now, when they leave that room or that meeting, what is my ask as a literacy leader for them? Probably the most important part of the entire process. When they go back to their classrooms, we've confronted these gaps in data in the meeting. Now, in my instruction, where is that? What tool am I pulling from my toolbox? How am I changing my instruction based on our conversation that we just had? As a grade level team, are we meeting a couple times to talk about what's working and what's not throughout those, differences in those meeting times? So again, I know I've said this probably ad nauseum, but your intermediate unit and your patent representative can support you in that work of making sure that you're thinking through that before and during and after, so that we're not just doing it because it's on the calendar and it's what we're used to doing, right? The more we just stay with what we've been doing, we're going to keep seeing those 30% results.
Thank you, Erin. As you were saying that before, during, and after the data meeting, it made me think of the look force and how you can tie that into those data meetings, the actionable steps after, and then building together as that team looking at data. What are the look fors now from here until the next time?
Exactly, Andrea. Exactly.
And then that makes it less, all of these things, you can tie those all together.
Correct.
Erin, thank you so much for your information, the resources, encouraging all of us to be bold, to make bold moves, not make them all at the same time, but just start making those bold moves, and your conversation today. So thank you, Erin.